Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Zevachim Daf Mem Tes Zevachim 49. The Gemara. We're going to start around 10 lines from the top on 49a. The Gemara has a question. Asham Mino on the Beit. We've already proved that the Chatas and the Oah require to be slaughtered in the northern part of the courtyard of the temple. How do we know that Karban Asham also requires to be slaughtered in the north? Gemara says, it says in the pasuk, in the place where you slaughter the oah, there you should slaughter the asham. Gemara says, well, ashkan shlita. Okay, fine. We know that the slaughter requires the north. Kabbalah minon. How do we know that the receiving of the blood of the asham also requires the north? Gemara says, because it says v'estamo yisrok. So because it says the blood you have to be sprinkled. So the Gemara says, so this proves kibul damo nami b'tzapon. Since you sprinkle it from there, we see from here that the receiving of the blood has to be in the north. How do we know that the one who receives the blood himself also has to be in the north? So the Gemara says, because it could have said damo, it said damo ve'estamo, but it could, from the fact it says estamo, but it could have just said damo. That's when we know the person who receives the blood also has to stand in the north. Ashkan mitzvah. Okay, we see that this is the ideal. But how do we know these halachos la'akev, that if you don't do it, it's disqualified? Gemara says, krach rinaksiv. It says a different pasuk. It says, v'shachat es hakeves. It says you shall slaughter the sheep in the place where you slaughter the sin offering and the oil offering. Since it repeats it, it's to teach us this idea that the asham needs to be slaughtered in the north. Gemara asks a question, that's what this pasuk is coming to teach us? By the way, don't we need this pasuk to teach us something else? Look at the Tanya. As we went to the Brisa, davar shali b'chal. Let's say there was something that was in a general category, and then it went out to be talking about something new. That under those circumstances, you can't go back to the general category until you go back and make a general rule to include it again. And what's the example? This example, this is the pasuk we just cited. So you should slaughter the sheep for the asham in the place where you slaughter the sin offering and the oah. In the holy place, because it's like the asham is like the sin offering. It doesn't need to tell us that the asham is like the chadas. Why does it say that? Because the asham of the mitzorah has a unique law. It was talking about something else. Babo and yad, babo and regel, babo and yamonis, that it has the blood applied to the ear, the big thumb, and the big toe. I might think that it doesn't require what the other kabbanos require, which is the applications on the altar. Just like the sin offering requires applications. So too does the asham. So therefore, this pasuk is not repeated to tell, the Gemara is asking, this pasuk is not being repeated to tell us that the asham requires the north. It's being repeated to tell us that the asham has all the other halachos of the asham. The Gemara says, no, imkein nechtov b'hai v'lechtov b'hai, because if that would be the case, it would only be written by the asham mitzorah. It wouldn't have to be written the laws of shlita by those Torahs of asham, and we would learn out from there. But the fact that it was written by both, it's likuva. It's to tell us it's required. The Gemara says, well, this only makes sense. This only works if you're of the position that if it goes to talk about a new thing, it is the one that's not learned out from the general rule. But the fact that the general rule is learned from it, that makes sense. Shapir. We're on the top of 49a. First of all, big shkoyach to Deborah and Aaron Zamir, who even though it's 6 a.m., you got up on a Sunday morning to study the daf. Shkoyach. Ella is svirulon delo hu gamar mikolo lo kol gamar minei. But if it's to teach us that you can't learn from either one, that's the case. How don't we need this pasuk to teach us the general rule of all these applications of the chatos? You can't learn out from either one. So Gemara says, no, keep it. Gemara answers, the Gemara says under those circumstances, the Gemara says no. Even the Ahadre. The Gemara answers, since the Torah went back to the Hashem Torah, therefore it returned to the general requirement of the Tzafon as well, of the north as well. So the Gemara says, but maybe that's not the case. So Amar Lemar Zutra Berei Rav Maru Ravina. Maybe when the pasuk goes back, it only goes back for some of the laws of the asham, i.e., that it requires a kohen, it requires the applications of the blood and the murim, which are stuff that the kohen requires. But the law of shlita, the law by kahuna, but we know that the slaughtering of the animal doesn't require the kahuna. Maybe lomi by itself, or maybe it doesn't require the north. Where it says no, imke nema kra ki chatasu. Because the pasuk could have said it's like this sin offering. My kechatas hasham. Why does it say kechatas hasham? As to teach us keshar hashamos yeh, that it'll be like all the other hashamos, and so therefore, as Rashi explains, it's to teach us this law that it also goes back to the north. And when it says shchita b'tzafon by the second verse, it's teaching us that it's a requirement. And so therefore, it's teaching us that all the hashamos are required it to be in the north. So the Gemara says, well, now the Gemara has a question. We say that the hasham is like the chatas and the oah. Why does it need to compare it to both? Why it could just say it's like one of them when we learned out the north. Why does the pasuk need to say that you slaughter the sin, the asham, in the place where you slaughter the sin offering and the oah? It could have just said it one of them. So the Gemara's answer to this question is Amar Avina. It's I need to compare it to both. First of all, big boker tov to Mordechai and Aviva, waking up early on a Sunday morning to study the daf together with the Chavrusas, Aaron Zamir, and Deborah, Baruch Hashem. So the Gemara says, Amar Ravina, it needs to be compared to both the chatas and the oah, because if the pasuk was compared to the chatas, if the asham was compared to the sin offering and not to the oah, I would have said, where is the sin offering going from? From the oah. I would say the whole concept of, so if we just had the chatas, if it says the asham is like the chatas, that would have been a problem, because the whole source of the fact that the chatas is done in the north is only that it's derived from the oah. And so then I might have thought, chatas mechal amda oah, that where's the chatas learned from? The oah. And we have a concept, davar lame behekesh, choser mulame behekesh. And I would have said that it's coming to teach us that something that is derived from a comparison, i.e., that the chatas is done in the north, is learned out from the oah, and so therefore it's learned out itself from what's called a hekesh through a comparison. And I would have said, therefore, that we always apply this principle that something that's learned through a hekesh can go back and teach also through a hekesh. And so that's what it's coming to teach us. But since that it compares it to both, we say that this form of interpretation is not going to be valid. So Amroi Marzutra. So why don't we just compare to the oah and not to the chatas, and we won't have that concern? You could just compare it to the oah offering, which is the source of the north. The Gemara says no, because if we did that, because so he says, excuse me, I skipped the line. So the Gemara says no. The Gemara says, so the Gemara says, why don't we compare to the oah and not to the chatas? No, Gemara says, if you would say that, I would have said, something that is derived through a hekesh can in turn teach that law through a hekesh. And if you'll say nikushe akushe lachatas, and if you'll say then the pasuk should have compared it to a chatas, I would have said no, I would have said that the Torah prefers to compare it to the ikar, i.e., to the oah, and not to the tafel, which is the sin offering. Therefore, the Torah compares it to both the chatas and the oah. In order to teach us, davar behekesh, That something that is compared to a hekesh does not go back and teach with a hekesh. Rava says mehacha. Rava Amar mehacha. Rava says from here. Del siv kasher. Rava says that the idea that the so Rava says this principle that davar hame mehekesh, that something is learned out from comparison, does not go back and teach from mehekesh. Rava says it's learned out from here because it says about the power of the Kohen Gadol, the bowl of the Kohen Gadol. Kasher yuram mishor zevachim. He shall separate the fats just like he separates from the carbon shlamim. So the Gemara says, so why does it need to say just like he separates mishor zevachim? If it's to tell us, if it's to tell us that when the Kohen brings his bull, that we're going to remove the liver and the kidneys, just the Yoseres HaKavod is the kodei lobe of the liver, and the two kidneys, just like they're removed from the shlamim. Begufik, if it says that explicitly in the pasuk, it says that. So the Gemara explains, Mishum da ba agmuri Yoseres HaKavod ushtei koyos miparal davar tzibur otzirav otzkochavim. So the reason why the Torah adds Mishor Zevach Hashlamim is to tell us, because the Torah wants us to teach us this law of the Yoseres HaKavod, the lobe and the kidneys, wants to learn it out from the laws of the communal offering, Param Davar Shel Tzibur, and the goats of idolatry. If that's the case, Begufik Siv, this and Begufik Siv, and this law is not written in those cases, Ripar Kona Mashiach Hudagamar, and it's learned out explicitly from the bull of the Kohen Mashiach. So therefore, it needs to repeat just like it would be separated from the bull of the Shlamim. So it's as though it was written specifically by the power of the Kohen Mashiach in order to teach it specifically to the power so therefore, it's to teach us this principle. So we wouldn't think that something that's learned out by a hekesh can go back and teach to a hekesh. In order to make sure we don't make that mistake, the Gemara repeats it by the bull of the Mashiach, and it says just like it's done by the Shlam. So so why doesn't it just say it explicitly by the bull of the Shlam? It should just say it explicitly. The Gemara says no, because of begufei v'lo akish. If the Torah would write these words specifically by the Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibur and not compare it, Hava Amina, then I would have said Davar Behekesh Chozer Mulam Behekesh. I would have said that it can be learned out through a comparison. I wouldn't have known that law doesn't apply. So it specifically wrote it like this to tell us that law doesn't apply. So the Gemara says, and if you want to say, let the Torah compare the Param Davar of the Kohen HaMashiach with the Param Davar Shel Tzibur, so that it can then be taught to the Siri of Oskhavim, Nichlei the Kasav Begufei. No, it would have been better to write it specifically by the Param Davar Shel Tzibur, Midei Akash Leikushei, rather than comparing it. So that's the reason why the Torah wrote it by the Param Davar Shel Tzibur and compared it to the Par Kohen HaMashiach. Tell us this principle that something that's learned out through a comparison, we don't go back and learn it out through a comparison. Gemara is now going to spend the next 2 days saying, how do we know we can't, or under what circumstances the 2 steps of interpretation apply, of derivation of drashos apply, meaning to say there are four ways of deriving that the Gemara is going to discuss. That Hakesh, which is the comparison, the Gzeira Shava, the 2 words that compare in different passages, the Binyan Av, the another form of comparison, and Kal V'chomer, and a logical argument. The Gemara is going to say, what do we say about the 2-step process in all those cases? So Hekesh, Gzeira Shava, Kal V'chomer, Siman, and Binyan Av. So the Gemara says, we've already just established that something that is learned out through a comparison in Chozer Mu'ami Behekesh cannot go back and teach something else through a comparison. Either it's learned out from Rava, like we just said, or Ravina, like we just said. But but let's say something is learned out from a hekesh. Can you go and teach through a gzera shava, through a word comparison? So Gemara says, let's answer this question through a brayso. Tashma Rabbi Nazar ben Thomas Omer, Minayil prichas begadim shei tahora. How do we know? We know that if the garment gets zarat, if the garment gets leprosy, that the garment is tamei. But if the entire garment gets zarat, if the entire garment gets leprosy, then we say it's tahor. So what's the basis of this idea that if the entire garment gets this zarat, it becomes tahor? Because it says nemar karachas v'gabachas b'begadim. It says the concept of karachas and gabachas, which are discolorations that make tumah. It says that by garments, and it says the same concept by a human being. Just like a human being, if the whole body has taras, it's tahor. So too, if the whole body has the garments, it'll be tahor. Gemara says, and then how do we know that if the whole body gets taras, he's tahor? Because it states, from his head until his feet. This gash rosho regel, and we compare his head to his foot. Malo on kua fachavam parach bekua tahor, and just like body tzaras, if the whole body turned white, it's tahor. Afkan, so too by head tzaras kua fachavam parach bekua tahor. So we see from here that once we learn out something from a hekesh, i.e., that the whole head is tzaras, it becomes tahor. So too we compare that to the body. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara rejects this. We can derive by everything. We can learn out something from what itself was learned out. Except for kachim. There we don't learn out something from what was itself derived. And we wouldn't say it by kachim. We learn out from a gzera shava from sin offerings. What's the reason why Torah repeats it? To tell us to teach us this idea, something that's learned out through a hekesh, we cannot go back and teach through a gzera shava. The Gemara says no. Maybe the Torah specifically doesn't want to do it by an asham mishum de equal mifra, because you could break it by saying because chatas is different from an asham, because the chatas atones for all the sin that you're liable for kares. The Gemara says no. This is, the Gemara says, and that it's written an extra kodshe kadashim. It's written an extra most holy by the chatos. It says that word kodshim, that it's extra holy by the chatos, and so therefore the gzera shava is free on both sides, and so therefore it can't be rejected, and so therefore the Gemara is specifically telling us that by kodshim you can't do this two-step analysis. It's only by the rest of the Torah that you could learn out one thing from another, but by the most sacred context you can't do it. And this is today's daf yomi. Baruch Hashem. I'll stop here. Thank you. I'm sorry for inconveniencing you, but I'm so inspired that you can't woke up early to study together. Shkoyach.